Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all back from your break and your networking and catching up. You know, these are such important events for us to connect and share our ideas. If you can all please take your seat now. I know we need a, oops, sorry. Don't break the equipment. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Thank you so much for participating in the REACH conference. We've had some amazing speakers with great vision, tremendous knowledge and expertise of policy, data. Hello. Thank you, Commissioner. Anyone else? We need some hooks in the back and to bring everybody forward back to your tables. So good morning, I'm CJ Reynolds, the Director of Resiliency and Engagement for the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. I've been working with the team for 2 years on this project, and a great privilege it has been with our program and people. So next slide, please, Sarah. So I think we are the presentation that we could refer to as the bad wolf and the three pigs, right? So we're going to talk to you about extreme flood events, hurricanes, and other kinds of disasters. So this morning you heard a lot about already the shortage, the challenges, the policy, the needs, the economic factors. This session is really the beginning of a conversation, well, not a beginning, and many of you have been working on these issues of resiliency, flood risk for decades. We know that extreme weather and climate change is exacerbating the housing shortage crisis. I don't have to read the slides to you. You have all lived and seen and watched the impacts from the hurricanes over the past years. And in our area, many no-name rain events, extreme rain events, have caused extensive flooding because of the small amounts of sea level rise that has already been happening. Next slide, please. So you have heard about the many partners here. I wanted to specifically mention the Florida Housing Coalition team, again, has been very involved. The Shimberg Center for Housing Studies, which with their expertise and the data sets that we've had access to and merged, which you're going to hear about from Andrea Golinski. Also, our colleagues at the University of South Florida, Florida Center for Community Design and Research, tremendous work that actually was part of our initiative was the work that they started doing several years ago in Hillsborough County, conducting vulnerability assessments. At that time, we were also working with Manatee County, this is in 2018, which really started to look at the impact of these flood risks to housing. And one of the things that was most interesting at one of our sessions was the fact that we had 3 different counties. We were all looking at this risk, but we were all doing it differently. And that was one of the aha moments on how do we standardize our approach to understanding the risks that our affordable housing actually face. And also collaborating with the United Way Suncoast. They're bringing to the table the understanding of the Alice situation and how important it is when we think about our families, what income we actually have, but we don't talk about the ongoing daily life expenses and the debts that we already have before we even try to rent or buy a house. So the cost of cars and, as we now know, the expense of food and all of that. So it required this entire team to pull this program together. And although he wasn't able to join us, I wanted to acknowledge Bill O'Dell, who's been a passionate advocate, and the amount of data that we have access to because of the work that Shimberg Center has been doing for the state and on behalf of the housings is really important. Next slide, please. So quickly, the REACH objectives were really about developing consistent frameworks, standardizing our approach so that when floodplain managers, GIS staff, housing planners could all sit down and understand, like, how are we really going to take stock and look at the impacts to affordable housing. We also really started to understand that there's a great amount of folks who have energy burdens, who pay a lot of money in different kinds of housing conditions. And so what can we begin as a region to look into? How do we assess housing? And you'll hear Terrence Savia, Sarah Kane, Lee Hayes Byron from Sarasota. So a lot of work in what is it we might need to do to retrofit our buildings, because climate And extreme weather also ties into increased heat. So those housing cost burdens of energy use will go up over time. And also a part of this grant was really intended to help us as a region develop goals related to resilient housing that would fit into the Tampa Bay's first regional resilience action plan, which Kara has been working on with us for several years. And we just had a great conversation with a lot of input at the summit. You'll see these posters on the other side. Those are the goals that we have, and we'll be preparing and providing an updated draft going forward to our members and our council members who've been with the steering committee very actively engaged in that. So a lot of this intended to work on supporting and updates to local plans, providing technical training and assistance, and as I mentioned before, integrating ALICE. So next slide, please. So one of our pride and joy, there's many tremendous resources coming out of this, but this is available for you and is being updated on a regular basis, is a web-based map application. The intent was to make it easy for anyone who was not a GIS guru or who didn't have a best friend that was a floodplain manager to be able to go and say, where is my housing located? Publicly assisted, different kinds. There's many different layers in that. I would do a shout out for, I believe it's May 26th or May 27th. We'll be doing the final technical training workshop for the REACH program at that time. So I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a really useful tool, and there's many more things behind it. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the suite of resources, the Florida Housing Coalition has developed a number of guides. Elissa will mention one of the key tools, which is a planning checklist. USF is also, so we have these things which will be, they're now actually, the links are live thanks to Maria on the website. The Guide to Conducting Community Vulnerability Assessment has a deep focus on social vulnerability factors combining with housing on that, which is basically a sort of a methodology review. So it really helps all of us to sit down at a table and be able to work and move forward in a consistent path, from planners to housers to floodplain managers and other folks as well. So I wanted to just give you a quick highlight of that. I believe that's my last slide there. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it over to Elissa Plancher, and she is not sitting here at the table, as you may notice, and she is not a ghost, but she does have, she was sick, so we were able to get permission and figure out how to stream her in today. So I appreciate all the tech on that, and Elissa will give us an update on the work that she's been doing with our local governments.
Thank you, CJ. And it's really wonderful to be with everybody today. I'm sorry that I can't join you in person. So before I get started, I just want to acknowledge the work that Gladys Cook and I contributed along with our teammates from the Florida Housing Coalition. As you can see their pictures on our first slide. So I'm going to be teaching you about all of our work with our REACH planning and housing self-assessment checklist for local governments that we created for the REACH project. And next slide, please. All right, so the development of the REACH checklist really was kind of a deep dive into the planning hierarchy, planning and policy starting at the federal level, going through state and local plan reviews. We coordinated with REACH partners, 10 local governments, conducted the self-assessment checklist, and Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council staff. We conducted beta tests, workshops, and webinars, provided direct technical assistance to local government staff, and conducted a data analysis, regional summary, next steps, and provided recommendations, which you can find in one of our final reports that CJ just mentioned. Next slide, please. All right, this is just kind of a quick snapshot of some of our tabs on the checklist. This is in an Excel format and a live link. And essentially, the classification, as you can see here, based on color, we have mandatory, which are like statutorily required policies or programs, best practices, evaluating strong performers, and also equity principles. And so each tab has these elements, and they are scored based on the classification. Next slide, please. All right, so I think this is one of the most important components to this project. And so when we're talking about community resilience, if everybody in the community doesn't have a strengthened home, the entire community cannot be considered resilient. And really, this is to withstand these hazards that we keep referencing, whether it's climate change-based hazards or your hurricanes, flooding, so on. And so resilience does occur when plans, policies, and programs prioritize housing hazard mitigation needs for vulnerable housing stocks, such as your substandard housing or mobile homes, which are often occupied by your most vulnerable community members, and those may be lower income households, elderly households, and persons with disabilities. And oftentimes these substandard housing types are located in hazard areas. And so this means that when we're prioritizing housing hazard mitigation, all of these community members can withstand threats like hurricanes or floods, and this decreases their displacement, either allowing them to shelter in place or return home quickly after an event occurs. Next slide, please. Okay, so with the goal being a resilient housing stock, what we've learned from this whole project with all of our partners is that number one, this really requires interdisciplinary coordination. And part of this is really creating consistency among planning frameworks, whether it's in one jurisdiction or region-wide. And so that was the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council. The vulnerability analysis that we speak of is the University of South Florida. Hazard analysis, that is that flood hazard mapping tool that's developed by University of Florida Shimberg Center for Housing Studies. And then our role in this are the plans, policies, and programs. And so what we've learned is that these objectives, putting these objectives and elements together can result in a resilient housing stock. Next slide. And so there's a lot of opportunity based on each individual plan. What we learned from our review based on the hierarchy of plan and policies is that the comprehensive plan, local mitigation strategy, your local housing assistance plan, post-disaster redevelopment plan, your community rating system, floodplain management, with which deals with your national flood insurance program, and construction rehabilitation standards have a direct impact in your community's ability to create housing hazard mitigation and resilience policies and actually implement them through spending plans. And just one example of the plans, for instance, the local housing assistance plan. If local governments define and require disaster housing mitigation and SHIP funded housing activities and evaluate incentive opportunities that can further support mitigation strategies, these are really simple opportunities to really incorporate housing hazard mitigation that specifically target the most vulnerable community members in the most at-risk housing types. Next slide, please. And when we completed the regional analysis based on the 10 local governments that participated in conducting the self-assessment checklist activity, this resulted in top 3 performing plans based on score. And the first one is your local mitigation strategy. And essentially what this means is that housing resilience should be part of the LMS in the hazard assessment, as well as the LMS initiatives and projects through capital improvements and public awareness. And the LMS action plan also identifies specific mitigation projects, which includes housing hazard mitigation and can support prioritizing housing mitigation projects as funding becomes available. The second plan that is best performing was the community rating system plan, which is also floodplain management. And this is really essential because, FEMA is responsible for the administration and implementation of the National Flood Insurance Program and the community rating system. And this ensures that floodplain management is integrated with local resilience planning efforts. And local governments must react to expansions of flood rate insurance maps or flood insurance rate maps zones while development pressures and coastal and non-coastal hazards are unabating. And so we know that every community strives to have the highest community rating efforts, which rewards floodplain management compliance with lower insurance premiums. And so local governments have the opportunity to request technical assistance from the State Floodplain Management Office, and they can assist in the development of local floodplain ordinance language and also evaluate the need for higher development standards to support flood-resistant construction. And the comprehensive plan is the number 3 performing plan in the region. And this is the statutory statement of each community's long-range plan policies for future development. And the comprehensive plan and its elements provide an opportunity to envision and implement a sustainable future for residents and the economy and natural environment. And so this plan is really seen as the jumping off point for community-wide resilience programs and that are designed to assist or assess risk and mitigate potential harms to people and homes. Next slide, please. So for our regional analysis, we also identified the areas with the greatest potential for improvement. The first one is your post-disaster redevelopment plan. And while the post-disaster redevelopment plan is for specifically post-disaster, housing policies can help survivors recover faster through repair or replacement of damaged uninhabitable housing with sustainable resilient housing. And so there is an opportunity to enrich the analysis of hazard impacts to the housing stock, develop long-term recovery strategies, and promote hazard mitigation and resilience efforts specific to the affordable housing stock. The second plan with the greatest potential for improvement are your construction and rehabilitation standards. And construction standards address how mitigation treatments and green building practices are included in planning and development processes. Some policies are linked to floodplain management ordinance to reduce the impact of flood hazards built on the environment or on the built environment. And rehabilitation standards, such as those required for HUD rehab programs, should include hazard mitigation, energy efficiency, and green building standards as basic requirements. And construction or rehab standards should make sheltering in place a principal goal for all residents. This will guide priorities and programs to the most vulnerable residents, with inclusion and equity as the centerpiece of home hardening retrofits. And the last area for greatest potential for improvement in the region are the hazard assessments. When determining a community's ability to withstand weather-related hazards, it is essential to identify and evaluate which structures, locations, and populations in the jurisdiction would be most at risk if a catastrophic event were to occur. Identifying weaknesses in the residential housing stock in advance of a hazard can allow for local government's ability to plan for and respond to community needs in a prioritized manner, reducing the negative impact of the hazard. This strategic and targeted approach to investment can target mitigation in areas most at risk, protecting the safety and well-being of a community's most vulnerable residents, while preserving the community's stock of affordable housing. And lastly, we do suggest developing a standalone housing resilience strategic plan to establish the framework through planning and policy that is intended to develop a foundation where a community takes a consistent and comprehensive approach to addressing housing vulnerabilities and targeting investment, which will prevent long-term displacement of vulnerable residents, reduce the timeframe of post-disaster housing recovery, and decrease the reliance on federal resources that require delayed distribution. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. All right. Hey, everyone. I am Andrea Golinski. I am an assistant scholar at the University of Florida and an affiliate with the Shimberg Center for Housing Studies. I'm very pleased to be speaking with you all here today, but I want to acknowledge my other team members that have really made this project possible, including Bill Odell, Ann Ray, Dr. Abdul Nasser Arafat, Sam Braverman, and Alejandro Ramos. So I won't touch upon this slide very long because we've heard a lot today about our increasing challenges with affordable housing and how it's getting more and more difficult to find less expensive rental units in. I do want to let everyone know that as part of this work, the Shimberg Center has also developed a data portal for local governments where you can get a wide range of information that can support your housing needs assessment. So we have information on tenure, income, AMI, cost burden, various assisted housing, property details, so on and so forth, that we hope that we're able to provide a lot of data and information that can really help drive the decision-making of local governments. So today, I think Elissa set us up with some really great thoughts from a planning and policy perspective. And so now I'd like to share some of our initial findings that provides that kind of underlying data infrastructure, especially to her indicators that she talked about. Where are the locations that are more vulnerable? What are the types of housing and what type of people may be more vulnerable to flood hazards? So first, we wanted to get a lay of the land in terms of what type and where is the region's affordable housing stock located. So in this case, we really looked at 3 buckets. The first being publicly subsidized housing, the second being what we sometimes call naturally occurring affordable housing, or NOAA, which is essentially market rate rental housing that's more affordable naturally due to the fact it might be older, so on and so forth. And then the third bucket is mobile homes, and we want to look at both individually owned parcels as well as mobile home parks. And so then what we wanted to do was really better understand how both current and future flood hazards may impact these different types of housing stock. And so we built a web app that Sujay had shared the link previously. And this includes a number of flood hazards, such as the FEMA floodplain, storm surge, sea level rise, king tide, flooding plus sea level rise, the 10-year storm surge plus sea level rise. We are able to look at a number of time periods and different scenarios. So I encourage you to, check it out, and you can select the different, attributes that are of interest to you. And what we did is we combined all of this hazard data and applied essentially a low, medium, and high score to any of the housing types mentioned earlier. And so this is just a very simple presence absence. It doesn't take into account the structure's, actual first floor elevation. This is just a very kind of broad scale exposure index. But what we can see here, and I think this slide is probably, if you take anything away, take home kind of the high points here is that when we look at these 3 different buckets of affordable housing, that 66% of the publicly subsidized housing, 61% of that NOAA, or that affordable market rate housing, and 56% of the mobile homes across the region are within a flood hazard area. So this is any place that had one or more of these coastal flood hazards. So as you can see, this is a significant amount of stock across the region that could potentially be affected by a storm event. And I'm just going to barely scratch the surface of the information that we have available. But if you want to kind of dig deeper and learn more about, what this means for, what types of hazards, where this can just give you a sense of, which of the, for example, publicly subsidized properties are impacted by what type of hazard. So you can see those coastal flood hazards, taking the big picture, don't necessarily impact the large majority of housing stock. It really is when you kind of get to that 100-year floodplain and the storm surge categories that have kind of the most counts of units affected. And I think this is important because at times we have looked at our future flood hazards as, it's going to be sea level rise caused impacts, but we need to know that across the region, we have sea level rise issues and we have inland flooding issues. So there's lots of problems everywhere. But looking at future impacts, I thought this slide was really interesting in that it shows some sea level rise influenced hazards, both at current day and in the future at 2070 using a NOAA intermediate high scenario. And that there is an 816% increase in the number of units that are exposed to that king tide hazard. So this kind of these coastal challenges are here and they are going to continue. So just very briefly, you can kind of dig deeper and deeper into the data set here. And what I wanted to illustrate with this chart is that you can say, look into when you're thinking about, well, where do we start? How do we start prioritizing areas to mitigate? You could, for example, take all of the assisted units that might have a high level of exposure and then start to dive in the details and learn more about that location. So what is that target population? You can see here, there's elderly, family, persons with disabilities. The other thing I'll note is that the average household income for these buildings is quite low. You can see $11,000, $21,000 annually. So this can allow us to really kind of put all of these various pieces together. We know about the hazards. We can learn more about the building type itself, the age, so on and so forth, as well as the tenant characteristics who are living in that property. So just some regional takeaways are that the assisted housing properties are going to be increasingly subject to multiple coastal flood hazards over time. And so these properties could be explored for those prioritized mitigation actions. Direct inundation due to sea level rise or those sea level rise related hazards may not affect this stock in terms of just broad numbers of counts as other hazards, in part because some of our assisted and affordable housing are not right on the coast, they're inland. And so we want to not lose sight of focusing as well on those properties that are in the 100-year floodplain or might be in those storm surge areas. So it's kind of, we want to balance how we look at our current and future flood hazards. And with that, I will turn it over to Matt, who will give us a deeper dive into some analysis.
Thanks, Andrea, for that great overview at the regional level and the kind of introduction to the data that we've been working with over the past 8 or so months, or at least that I've been working with them. My name is Matt Varkony. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Miami, and I'm working with the Tampa Bay Regional Planning Council to help dig a little bit deeper into the analysis at the county level. And the goal of this analysis, density analysis, is to identify areas of highly concentrated flood-exposed affordable housing. So we know throughout these counties that there is a good amount of affordable housing that is exposed to different flood hazards. And this density analysis is meant to kind of identify certain locations throughout these counties that may be targeted for more efficient use of the funds, more efficient use of mitigation strategies that we can try to use to kind of mitigate some of these flood hazards. And kind of the main takeaway from this table right here is that throughout these 7 counties or throughout these 6 counties that we have shown, there's a general difference in the amount of dispersion of affordable housing. So if you look specifically at Hillsborough County, this density analysis captures about 26% of all affordable housing, meaning that in Hillsborough County, affordable housing is fairly dispersed, right? It's fairly spread out throughout the county. But if we look at Manatee County, for example, this density analysis will capture about 75% of the affordable housing stock. And this includes NOAA, AHI units, and mobile homes. Right. And we also do this for different subsets of the data. So we'll look at 1% annual flood zones, 0.2% annual flood zones, and then we also look at surge categories. So what we do is we'll narrow down this general data set of affordable housing, and we'll look specifically at housing that is exposed to these different flood hazards. And we'll try to identify certain locations that can be kind of attacked to kind of reduce their hazard exposure. So these next set of maps are going to show you kind of the two extremes. First, we're going to look here at Hillsborough County. And these are all the locations of affordable housing throughout the county that are exposed to the 1% annual flood zones. And if you kind of look at this map, you can kind of see what the table was telling us earlier, is that housing is fairly dispersed throughout the county. So there's a lot of housing in, the south, north, east, and west that it's exposed to 1% annual flood zones, which makes it a little bit more difficult to identify certain locations that we should target for mitigation. But with this density analysis, what we can do is we can identify some of these locations that have the highest concentrations of exposed housing. And it allows us to kind of dig in a little bit deeper on these specific locations. And then combined with local expertise, the benefit of this is that we can identify these locations and say, hey, these are some highly exposed areas of affordable housing. Maybe we should start targeting funds in these locations right away, right? And this is going to allow us to kind of get a foot up on picking the most exposed targets. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have Manatee County, which has just in general a highly concentrated level of affordable housing. So this again is dispersion of affordable housing in the 1% annual flood zone in Manatee County. And as you can see, the map looks a little different than Hillsborough County. That's not just because it's a different county, but that's also because there's more concentrated areas of affordable housing. So if we look at the hotspot analysis for this specific county, we can see that the majority of affordable housing that's exposed to 1% annual flood zone is located along the coast near Bradenton, Longboat Key. So from this analysis, we can dig even deeper, right? And that was kind of the goal of this project, was to figure out specific neighborhoods that we could target with different mitigation funds. And this neighborhood analysis looks at the highest concentrated areas exposed to multi-hazards. So we look at 1% annual flood zone and high frequency storm surge, which is category 3 storm surge. So we look at all homes that are exposed to both of these different hazards. And then we try to identify certain social vulnerabilities that may compound some of these hazards. And what you can kind of see from this chart is that in general, by definition, a lot of these neighborhoods that have high concentrations of affordable housing also have median incomes lower than the county median income. And that's something we come to expect, right? But the interesting thing that we can look at is that in a lot of these neighborhoods, there's an inverse relationship between minority percentage and elderly percentage, right? So some of these neighborhoods have more have a higher elderly percentage than the county average, while on the other end of the spectrum, they'll have a lower percentage of minorities in these neighborhoods than the county average. And that's something that we want to pay attention to because it gives us kind of more insight on different funds that we can look into at the federal or the state level to kind of build up some of these projects to mitigate against flood hazards. So these next 3 maps that I'm going to show you are deep dive straight into Manatee County. And they look at this neighborhood analysis that will be expanded on for all 7 counties in our report. But if you look at this analysis, you can see that some of these neighborhoods have median incomes well below the county median income. Specifically in the middle of Manatee County, we see neighborhoods that have about $30,000 to $40,000 of median income, whereas in Manatee County, I believe the median income is somewhere in the 50,000s. So these neighborhoods are not only exposed to multiple hazards, but they also have a number of social vulnerabilities that can compound some of the outcomes, the negative outcomes that we would experience. Additionally, we can look at the percent of minorities in some of these neighborhoods. We can see that in some of these neighborhoods, there's a high percentage of minority populations, and then there's not some further along the coast, right? But if we look at the next map of elderly percentage, we see the flip, right? So a lot of these neighborhoods that had higher minority percentages are going to actually have lower elderly percentages, and then vice versa. And we can get a better idea of that when we compare these maps side by side. And it's pretty interesting to look at this and to realize that some of these different social vulnerabilities are at play as well. It's not just about exposure when we talk about vulnerability. Affordable housing is an issue that we have to deal with as a population, but there are some populations that have been categorically underfunded, and these are areas that we should definitely focus on kind of spending our mitigation funds to kind of bolster their resilience to these different climate hazards.
All right, and to kind of wrap things up, this has, I don't know, maybe been a little bit of the less optimistic side when we start thinking about all of our flood hazard challenges, but we still want to take the view that there's a lot we can do now to reduce our future flood hazard risk. And so one of the kind of big picture takeaways is that housing planners and housing program managers really need to be involved in housing and rather local mitigation strategies. And we really need to bring that housing and especially publicly subsidized housing much more to the fore in our overall local mitigation strategies. In addition, I think this analysis also reveals that there are various kind of opportunities and benefits that come from starting to kind of piece apart these different housing types and how can we best approach mitigation strategies that are tailored to these different housing types. So for example, when we look at our publicly assisted housing, it is publicly funded. So there is a kind of public interest in mitigating these properties. Some benefits of doing mitigation here is that these buildings have income qualifications so that tenants are genuinely meeting those income limits. And so investment here really supports lower income households. We want to be able to leverage public investment sources, such as through HUD or at the federal level or the state level, and start to align these funding mechanisms, housing funding mechanisms, alongside mitigation funding. There are multifamily mitigation opportunities. There is a new Keep Safe Florida initiative that really starts to try to connect multifamily building owners with means to mitigate their properties. In terms of the naturally occurring affordable housing, there are both single family and multifamily mitigation opportunities. One potential area of opportunity is really starting to focus on reaching out to landlords, smaller local landlords that have a smaller kind of portfolio in areas and that might lack financing to do mitigation activities, and really try to give them more access to funds to do these sort of mitigation efforts, such as through SBA loans or other types of loans. Generally, there needs to be ideally a either regional or state level source of annual mitigation funding that we can have kind of in the works and know that people can count on this over time. And we also want to be better at distributing funding sources either now and in the future, and how can we leverage existing systems such as the SHIP that can help us distribute those funds more efficiently. Then in terms of mobile homes, those offer opportunities potentially for voluntary acquisition of parcels, potential upzoning of, say, for example, some large mobile home parks for more resilient housing and redevelopment. And then in addition to this focus on the mitigation of our current day housing stock, we also want to make sure that we're thinking about, well, where are we putting the new development? We have obviously a huge need for affordable housing, but where is it going? And how can we make sure that we're taking a holistic approach so that we want to balance, access to jobs, transit, as well as future flood hazards? And so with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you so much.
So the team has been really working hard to produce this data. A lot of this information will be released in detail in the next month. There are the reports on there on your table. We tried to cut this short so we can get everybody back on track. And so we were going to encourage you to have conversations at your table, but there's worksheets at your table. One says reach, there's other ones that are there. There's also maps at your table, but we're going to ask you to just put your ideas down on what do you think we should be doing together or individually or collaboratively between public and private partners, multi-jurisdictional efforts on housing and resilience. And this is one of the key questions is this meeting is not the end of the project. This meeting is the beginning of how we begin to work together and go forward on that. In particular, our next panel with the county commissioners is really going to, we will have a lot more conversations about that. You'll hear from the other sessions and going forward. So with that, we're done here today. And we're going to bring up, not today, I'm done. Thank you. Clearly, I'm done. The resources are on the website. These sessions have been recorded. The PowerPoints and the recordings will be available. I know that it's very helpful for you to take this information back to the folks who couldn't be here today. So thank you for your time. And thank you also to Matt and Andrea who've put in a ton of work on these things, and to Elissa.